water jug, that one's leaking.
Oh dear.
It started dripping on the stage. I knew I would slip on it, so.
Yeah, so, oh, but we don't have one right now.
No, I've got to get a new one.
Welcome to the Sunday morning audio test.
Well, I guess it's one more or less dry.
It works.
Okay, perfect. Get my phone.
So since that is right on the podium, it doesn't show me at all sitting over here.
Correct. Some of the wide angles do show you.
Good morning, and welcome to this service of worship at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tucson. For those of you who don't know, my name is Reverend Bethany Russell Lowe, and I have the great pleasure of serving as minister of this congregation. Our community is as varied as the blooms of the Sonoran Desert. Whoever you are, whoever you have been, and whoever you are becoming, I invite you to bring your whole self here, now. I extend a special welcome to visitors and invite you to fill out a guest information card, which our administrator, Mary Weiss, will post in the YouTube chat. And everyone is welcome to gather after the service at social hour on Zoom, soon after the service ends. Mary has a link in the YouTube chat now, and there was also one in your e-blast this morning. And this morning is our second of our live stream services in the past 18 months. These services are a movement down the path towards multi-platform worship. And you will see this micro movement this morning down this path. There are 9 of us here in Holland, although you'll just see a couple of us. Myself and Betsy McMillan is here as your worship associate. We have my baby, Otis, and the child care provider, Kaylee Weiss. We have Reverend Carla Stone-Brockie, Cassandra Klein, Cynthia Johnson, and Larry Newhouse here in the house. And Jesus Carrillo, our custodian, is somewhere on campus. But most of our worship leaders this morning have chosen to submit pre-recorded videos. They made this choice because they physically cannot take the risk of being here, or because they have made the decision to not expose others to the risk their families are taking. We are trying to model in these services and experiment with how we balance inclusion and flexibility as we move towards multi-platform congregational life. And another movement down this path since we last live streamed, your Board of Trustees has approved new policies, new guidelines to help us navigate the path towards in-person gatherings. I emailed these out to the listserv yesterday, but this policy is going to replace all existing COVID policies here at UUCT. And the new policy is a flexible one. It ties our practices to our risk level on a website called COVID Act Now. COVIDActNow.org is an organization that collects data on case numbers and infection rates and positive test rates in counties across the country and assigns a risk level to each county. So we are aligning ourselves with Pima County's risk level. And when Pima County has been at high or lower for at least 1 week consecutively, in-person, socially distant, masked indoor gatherings will be allowed again. And we're pretty close to that. We were at day 5 yesterday of the needed 7. You can ask me or see my email from yesterday for more information on that. And there's an exciting project that's emerging. It's not even quite ready yet, but I want to let you know because I've been telling folks and they've been getting excited. So I want you to have an opportunity to get excited too. It's something we're calling the Holland Project. For those of you who don't know or don't remember, this space that I'm in, we call Holland, after the family that helped fund the building. And the Holland Project is going to be, think like a European chapel, if you've ever been to one of those, or like a church that has open doors all the time and you can go in and light a candle or sit in silence or maybe meditate. We're going to open up Holland Sanctuary a few times a week to have open hours, office hours, so you can come in and spend some time here. You might come in with a friend, or you might come in with your family, you might come in alone. There'll be space for you to chat quietly with others. There'll be space for you to sit in silence, light a candle, maybe read a prayer, or maybe respond to a question we put on flip chart paper on the walls to ask things of our community. So it's an emerging project, like I said, and it requires us to be at that high or low level for 7 days or more, so we're not quite there yet, but it's in process, and it will be iterative once it's here, so we can make it whatever we want to make it. But look out for more information in your e-blast or here on that Holland Project. Welcome. Again, we are so so glad that you are here. Our call to worship words this morning come from my colleague and friend from seminary, Reverend Karen G. Johnson. Humans make maps of stars, choosing some stars, ignoring others, to project our imaginations onto the heavens. These maps shift over time across cultures. Names change for the same assemblage of bright points. Drinking Gourd, Big Dipper, Plow, Lost Hunters, Septarishi. Humans make constellations by connecting stars. Humans make meaning by connecting stories. Story to narrate to story. Some blaze bright, some are faint. Most are backdrop to the great and mundane human unfolding. Let us imagine the stories of our lives as a starry universe above our heads. As leaders in this congregation, we are tasked and trusted to draw constellations in this, our beloved small universe. May the stories we connect draw constellations that reflect a shared ministry that calls out the best in us. Come, let us worship together. And if you would, join in our words of chalice lighting this morning as Betsy lights our chalice. What is this fire? a match, a wick, a flame. What is this place? Wood and stone and glass. Yet here we have gathered in this place before this flame, making each holy by our presence here together.
The soul has lifted moments above the drift of days. When life's great meaning breaketh in sunrise on our ways, behold the radiant token of faith above all fear. Night shall release its splendor, that morning shall appear.
Hi, friends. The story I have for us today is the story of a practice of community making and resilience that's at least 200 years old. That is older than anyone who is alive today. And in fact, this practice probably goes back many, many years before them. Here's the story. The story happens to be just south of Selma in an isolated rural community of about 700 people. The official name of this community is Boykin, but it is more commonly known as Geesebend. The earliest known inhabitants of this area are the Muskogee Creek, but in 1816, a white man named Joseph Gee arrived from North Carolina and established a cotton plantation. He brought with him 17 enslaved persons. In 1945, that plantation was sold to Mark Petway, and many members of the community still carry his surname. After the Civil War in 1865, many of the newly freed remained on the plantation working as sharecroppers in untenable living situations. By the 1930s, the price of cotton fell and the community faced ruin. However, as a part of the Depression-era intervention, the federal government purchased 10 acres of the former plantation, providing loans to residents, which allowed them to stay in the community and build it together. In the 1960s, spurred by Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit to Alabama and the rising tide of civil rights, local women came together to found the Freedom Quilting Bee, a workers' cooperative that provided much needed economic opportunity and political empowerment and community. This tradition of quilt making that developed in Geesebend likely traces back to the earliest days of the plantation itself, drawing from a combination of African, Native American, and original techniques. Initially, Geesebend women made quilts to keep themselves and their families warm in their unheated shacks that lacked running water, telephones, and electricity long into the 20th century. Children slept on top of quilts under quilts wrapped up in quilts. As many as 6 or 7 quilts layered the corn husk-filled mattresses. More quilts covered the walls, along with pages torn from magazines and catalogs, not as art, but as protection from the drafts and the cold. Along the way, they developed a variety of distinctive styles, each of them a departure from the more structured traditions of European and European American versions of quilts. Their aesthetic has often been compared to jazz for improvisation and energetic, free-form perspective they express. Additionally, because of the isolation of Geesebend, they often reused whatever materials were at hand, old work shirts, blue jeans, reusing quilts to make new quilts. The quilts first came into national attention in the 1960s as they formed the Freedom Quilting Bee. Throughout the years, the collective has continued to gain friends and connections and is credited with causing a resurgence of popularity for quilts. By the 21st century, the quilts of Geesebend have formally been established as works of art. The museum exhibition, The Quilts of Geesebend, was held at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston in 2002 before traveling across the country. In 2003, 50 quilt makers founded the Geesebend Collective, which is owned and operated by the women of Geesebend. Every quilt sold by the collective is unique, individually produced, and supported by every other person involved in the collaborative. Today, the Souls Grown Deep community partnership, started in Geesebend, pursues racial, social, and economic justice by making grants and many more opportunities for organizations, businesses, and nonprofits. But importantly, they are advocating for folk art and artists across the country. So, what's a quilt for? Is it for putting in a museum? Is it for keeping warm at night? Is it for reusing fabric when an item has worn out? Maybe a quilt is to keep a community together through sharing history. Maybe a quilt is for keeping tradition alive as the world changes. Maybe it is for all these reasons and many more.
Good morning. Thanks, Jamelia, for the sharing with us the story of Geesebend. I had the opportunity a number of years ago of going to that touring exhibition, and it was truly wonderful. Now is the time in today's service for the offering to support the work of our church. Even though we are not all physically together right now, we continue to be joined in beautiful, beloved community. Our church depends on our financial support to sustain our work when we are at a distance from each other, as well as when we are together. There are several ways you can make your financial offering. You can give online at uuctucson.org/donate, or text to 833-361-5796, or simply send a check to our church office. Your offering today is generously given and most gratefully received. We have a spiritual practice at UUCT to honor our joys and sorrows. Just as our earth is strong, our shared bowl is strong enough to hold the big rocks, which signify our collective celebrations and mournings, and also the smaller stones that Reverend Bethany will add to signify our individual joys and concerns. One such joy is celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month that is observed from September 16th through October 15th. This month corresponds with Mexican Independence Day, which is celebrated on September 16th and recognizes the revolution in 1810, which ended Spanish dictatorship. But let us not forget our deep concern for the thousands of refugees and migrants fleeing Haiti, Afghanistan, Central America, and all around the world who have nothing except desperation and a little bit of hope. We who live in the desert know that water is a life-sustaining and scarce resource. Let us remember those desert people who came here in the first place. We honor the Hohokam, the Yavapai, the Tohono O'odham, the Yaqui, and the people who no longer exist as tribal entities here in Arizona. Let us remember those who are walking through our desert right now without access to water. We pour water from a plastic jug similar to the ones used by those seeking to assure access to water in the desert, like our ministry partner, No More Deaths. If you have a joy or sorrow, I invite you now to speak it aloud, or type it in the chat, or light a candle at home, or hold your thoughts in silence as Reverend Bethany drops the smaller stones into the water to symbolize the joys and sorrows within our community. As you type your joy or sorrow into the chat, Reverend Bethany will speak these joys and sorrows out loud later in the pastoral prayer. May these pebbles create ripples of hope even as we are far apart.
Spirit of love and life, amongst the many joys of this community, of these lives, there are also sorrows. We lift up the memory of Wendy Gordon Weeks' mom, Florence, who passed away in July. May her memory be a blessing. We lift up those neighbors of Kathy and Vicki who are at home with COVID. May they find strength and healing. We lift up two of Celeste and Linda's neighbors, two wives of neighbors who are approaching the end of life. May that transition be held in love. And we lift up, as Donna said, all those struggling with depression, anxiety, and other challenges due to the pandemic. And we lift up that final joy of seeing people we know in our space, which Bob voiced, but I know many of us have and share. Will you join me now in a moment of prayer, meditation, centering, whatever is your own style, as we hear these words from the poet Jane Hirschfield. There are names for what binds us. Strong forces, weak forces. Look around, you can see them. The skin that forms in the half-empty cup. Nails rusting into the places they join. Joints dovetailed on their own weight, the way things stay so solidly wherever they've been set down. And gravity, scientists say, is weak. And see how the flesh grows back across a wound with a great vehemence, more strong than the simple, untested surface before. There's a name for it on horses, when it comes back darker and raised. Proud flesh. As all flesh is proud of its wounds, wears them as honor given out after battle, small triumphs pinned to the chest. And when two people have loved each other, see how it is like a scar between their bodies, stronger, darker, and proud. How the black cord makes of them a single fabric that nothing can tear or mend.
Find the stillness, hold the stillness, let the stillness carry me. Find the silence, hold the silence, let the silence carry me. In the Spirit, by the Spirit, with the Spirit giving power, I will find true harmony. Seek the essence, hold the essence, let the essence carry me. Let me flower, help me flower, watch me flower, carry me. In the Spirit, by the Spirit, with the Spirit giving power, I will find true harmony.
I want to dedicate today's reading to my 94-year-old father-in-law, who is a brick mason. This reading is from UU Minister Reverend Meg Barnhouse's book. Did I say that out loud? Musings from a Questioning Soul. It's called Brick by Brick. All summer, workers have been building a brick wall along the road by my neighborhood. Against the brutal heat, they stretch a tarp overhead to get a little shade. I've watched them take bricks in their dusty brown hands one by one, butter them thickly with mortar, line them up and tap them down, row by row. One man who looks to be in his 70s is the leader. His skin is the color of bittersweet chocolate. His beard is gray. Slender and tall, he moves from one group of bricklayers to the next, reaching and bending, looking like a heron in a marsh. When he pauses, he stands very straight. I see him teach the others how to do the work. He stoops over to look at a line of bricks, hands on his thighs, inspecting the work. Sometimes, as I drive by, I see him put his hand on the back of the person he's teaching. Often, they are both smiling. He looks like he loves what he's doing. I wonder how he can love building walls day after day, handling bricks, teaching the art of laying bricks. Is it the teaching he loves? Seeing how his students learn, what their styles are, how their work shows their character? Does he love the wall itself? Does he know about when it'll be done? Does he look forward to seeing it finished? Or does he love the process? The feel of the bricks in his hands, the squish of the mortar, the challenge of making the symmetry of pillars and arches, the geometry of it? I think from the look on his face that he loves the process. I imagine that he never thinks about the end of the project, the completion of the wall. I think he will go on to the next wall as if it were just a continuation of this one, then the next one, and the next, and never be bored. I want to be like that. I am, I guess. In my job as a minister, the bricks are stories. I hear stories of family and work, stories of loss and reconciliation, stories of rejection and disaster, illness and healing, birthing and dying. I tell stories every Sunday, and in between teaching, challenging, confessing, inviting people to learn and laugh and think. Brick by brick, story by story, we build a church, seeing the patterns, the symmetry, the plain joy of setting one story on the other, sustained by the strong and beautiful structures they make. We will never be finished. It's okay.
I want to start by naming a few you have to be here to understand it moments I've been forgetting to include in the welcome words. There's no AC here in Holland. It's not working right now. So when you see some sweat on Betsy and my face, that's why. And all of us are sweating a little bit here. And another noticing of these pandemic times, one of the oddities of our choir singing outside, it was in the hundreds still when they started singing there. And as you all know, if you're here in Tucson, the mosquitoes are plentiful this year, so you saw them, right? I have to laugh. And another thing that I think is worth noticing is that this is the second time that my kid is sleeping through my sermon. I think it's funny. Every wedding has a few surprises, right? Exciting or anxiety producing, preconceived or of the moment, the surprises come. They're part of the humanness of those moments. They are often the things we remember from that transitional sacred day, whether ours or someone else's. At my partner's wedding, one of the surprises was this quilt. Months earlier, we had gathered with our parents to make cloth napkins for our wedding reception. After raiding my mom's fabric stash, cutting, folding, ironing, and sewing, we had over 150 cloth napkins for each of our guests. And my mom took the leftover fabrics from that napkin making process and made this quilt. This is the front. And then the back, we had out at our wedding reception, and the guests used it as kind of a guest book. There's some wise words on here, there's some drawings, there's some jokes, all things to bless, to carry us in our marriage. This lap-sized quilt, if I unfolded it, you could see it's just meant to cover one person's legs, maybe two, if you're sitting close. The batting inside is light, but it's noticeable when I lay it over my legs. The weight reminds me of those blessings signed onto the back. The blessings for courage and challenge, the blessings for strength and softening, The blessings for abiding love and continuing laughter are all held here. And mine is not the first nor the last quilt to carry that blessing with it. People have signed and sewn their own blessings into quilts for eons. Quilts are literal blessings. Legacies and stories of communities and families have been passed down through quilts, as Jamili helped us explore earlier through the lens of the Geesebend quilters. People have sewn and embroidered their wishes and hopes and dreams into squares and sewn them together. You've seen at least one in your life. When we see these community patchwork quilts, the metaphor doesn't need to be explained. Quilts are born of community. And our community, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tucson, is like a quilt in a lot of ways. Our stories, the stories we bring here, are those squares, like the bricks in the Reverend Meg Barnhouse reading that Betsy shared earlier. We come together from unique fabrics, tiny threads woven together over time, forming patterns that represent the uniqueness of who each of us is as individuals. And when we make the conscious choice to come to join a larger community, a larger weaving, larger threads are sewn between us, joining us to that common quilt. At first, we were just a few squares sewn together. And as we grew and expanded individually and collectively, patterns started to emerge. Soon enough, when you looked at this whole quilt, it became less about those individual pieces and more about the patterns, and also the nature of the threads that kept us together. In community, we lose some people, but the stories, that pieces of the quilt, remained. We change, we add new stories, new pieces, and so some more. We run out of thread, someone finds another strand, probably in the RE closet, and we continue to grow and grow and grow. And as I got thinking about this, I thought, if the pieces of the quilt are our stories, what is the thread? What is it that ties us to one another? I believe we are tied together by something. Contrary to what we often hear or maybe even say in our community, I don't personally believe that you can be a Unitarian Universalist and believe whatever you want. Though we are not tied together by a single political or social or economic or racial identity, and we aren't tied together by more that, and we are tied together by more than our history and our baggage, more than our church and city and state and region. We are tied together, of course, by Unitarian Universalist theology, one that is under the surface of our community, whether we express it or not. In her exploration of the core of Unitarian Universalism, Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker offers that there are 4 things that draw a circle around Unitarian Universalist communities that hold our theology. These 4 things allowed us to hold a permeable boundary between what we are and what we are not. And these are the 4 things that she proposes allow us to draw that boundary. 1, we hold that freedom is real and essential characteristic of life. 2, we hold that salvation is universal. 3, we are confident that revelation is not sealed. And 4, we hold that this world, this life, these bodies are the dwelling place of the sacred. Reverend Parker offers that the boundary we draw with these 4 attributes is not meant to exclude, but to help us clarify who we are and who we are not. She writes, within these theological boundaries, there is room for tremendous variety, diversity, and dissent. But there is also a defining focus, a devotion to the flourishing of life. We are devoted to the sacredness of this world, this life here and now. We do not look to a world to come as more valuable than this world. So to review, these are the 4 things that Reverend Barker says we use to hold that theological boundary of who we are. Freedom of life, universal salvation or lovedness if salvation doesn't work for you. Knowing that we are unfinished and believing that all life is sacred and the sacred is in life. These are the threads that tie our stories together. These are the things that make our separate pieces into one quilt, our separate stories into one community. And these threads didn't emerge out of nowhere or out of Dr. Parker's personal beliefs, although they're reflected, certainly. But I see them in the echoes of the at least dual theological roots we have. Unitarianism calls us to explore freedom of thought and life and to embrace those freedoms within the broadness of our faith. And Universalism inspired us to call all life and us as part of it sacred without reservation. When our faith became post-Christian and later explicitly multi-faith, we more fully embraced the idea that revelation is not sealed. We are not finished. There's not one single truth that holds us, but the truths together mixed up hold us, define us, make a more full truth. These values, these core ideals, these threads, they bind us together and they propel us forward. Reverend Sean Neil Barron, a Unitarian Universalist currently serving in Fort Collins, Colorado, has a beautiful reading called A History of Church, Including Yours. And even though the words are long, I'm going to ask you to buckle in because I'm going to use them to end my homily. I couldn't decide which ones to cut, and if I had been more prepared, I could have given them to Betsy to read, but here we are. And Reverend Sean gets where we're going. Jamelia is going to continue this metaphor in a short reflection to end our service. But hear these words from Reverend Sean now. One day your church was born. Maybe it was a gathering of saints called together for the common worship of a wrathful God, ceaselessly praying between bouts of decrying the evil of Christmas or dancing. Or maybe a few brave souls answered a notice in the newspaper, curiosity piqued by the announcement of a religion where free thinking and tolerance were bedrocks. No matter how it happened, your church was born, a gathering of people, humble, caring, anxious, and quirky, all at the same time, who covenanted to be with one another on the journey of life, death, and everything in between. And so it began, a faithful few, beautifully imperfect, called to the central task, that human task of connecting, loving, and serving. It was just a baby, and yet it was thrust deep into the human condition, tasked to hold minds and souls, bodies and hearts along the roller derby of disease and birth, infighting and joy and Christmas pageants, sometimes all of those at the same time. They gathered to hear the world broken open, for insightful sermons, rejuvenating music, and community whose fierce devotion to each other's well-being rivaled a mama bear's for her cubs. But it wasn't always like that, of course. There were the trying times. And I don't just mean Phyllis or Jack, those stubborn but lovable souls who inhabit the never world of committee meetings. No, I mean the trying times, when the church almost split in half over the war or integration, or when the mill left the town vacant, or when the minister crossed that line and people couldn't speak about it for decades. But somehow, you were still here, still on this town common, still the church that everyone recognizes, still the ones that show up every time you were called on, still using the communion silver until you voted to sell it. New people came, they changed things. Small things, big things, things that nobody noticed as it happened until suddenly it was hard to even notice anything anymore. That was a hard moment, a tearful moment. And other things changed too. The proclamations about God, once heard loud from the pulpits, softened. Wrathful became loving, distant, intimate, mandatory, optional. After the war, the nursery and RE classrooms were overflowing. Each baby dedicated reminded the church of the incredible beauty of life and the gift of this community, all huddled around baby, who would bestow upon this child. The history of your church, this church, is more of a story of the determination of love to break forth than it is about the tie-dye or chalices, sermon discussions, or social justice committee meetings. The history of the church is the history of human enterprise, evolving around its sights and sounds, yet revolving around its core. The history of your church is the gift of potential and momentum, of baggage and personality. The history of your church is the launch pad from which you spring into action or disarray. Each day, your church is born. I hear in these words a call to remember that the quilts we are creating is still unbound, and that's on purpose. The binding of the quilt is that piece around the edge, right? That green piece across this white backing. You put it on last once the front and the back are connected and there's some binding in between and you've stippled it or put it together. The binding goes on then. It's one of the last pieces you put on. This quilt that we are is without a border. We have fraying edges waiting for the next piece, the next story to be joined with thread. The quilt of this community is not meant to be finished. We are thread together with strong values and still unbound at the edges, waiting for the next stories to join us, waiting for that new pattern to emerge. We are unfinished, and that should continue. Amen. Blessed be, and may we make it so.
Though below me I feel no motion, standing on these mountains and plains, far away from the rolling ocean, still my dry land heart can say, I've been sailing all my life now, never harbor or port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home. Sun, my sail, and moon, my rudder, and the wide the starry sea, leaning over the edge in wonder, casting questions into the deep, drifting here with my ship's companions, all the kindred silver souls, making our way by the lights of the heavens in our beautiful blue boat home. thanks to the waves upholding me. Hail the great winds urging me on. Greet the infinite sea before me. Sing the sky my sailor's song. I was born upon the clouds, as the heart of the the wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is like blue. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is like blue.
Since we've been home over pandemic time, many of you have commented on this quilt that is hung as a background in my office. As you might know, my sister is a prolific quilter. She made this by hand, and I get to hang it up in my office and look at it throughout the day, many times during the day, because it hangs behind me. But as I'm watching myself on Zoom, this is what I see. And it's a gentle reminder of my sister and of the quilting and the lessons that I learned. Because while she is a prolific quilter, this was my last attempt at quilting. Not nearly as elaborate or intricate or finished as hers was. But sometimes we will get our quilting supplies out and we will sit together and we will attempt to put fabric together. And really what we're doing is we're stitching together our hearts and our experiences. Sometimes I get frustrated when what I want to stitch together doesn't come together. And it's at those times where she says to me, remember, you're not sewing if you're not unsewing. This little tool thing, which I don't know, I call it a thread picker, whatever it is actually one of the most important tools somebody who sews has, because we will make mistakes. We will need to go back and undo the work that we've done. And we do. You're not sewing if you're not unsewing. It's such an important lesson for me who struggles with perfectionism and wanting it to be just right immediately. And it's not. It takes time and it takes work. And sometimes, like my little quilt, it won't ever be finished. That's okay.
In these times of distancing, still, may we find ways to stitch our hearts to one another's. May we stay woven to this place, to each other, even as we are different. May we find those places that need undoing and undo them together. We are not finished. We're not bound. We're not even meant to be done. So let us find joy in the doing and the undoing, and enjoy the comrades who have chosen this journey with us. As we extinguish our chalice, stay healthy, stay connected, friends, until we see each other again.